All right. Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Improving Building Sustainability with Leading Edge Technology. This is a live panel discussion with Jonathan Pierce, Rob Simpson, and Daniel Intalube Camille. Throughout the discussion today, we'll be covering how technology can reduce costs, improve sustainability, and heighten efficiency. So I'd like to briefly introduce myself, and then I'll hand it over to the speakers to give quick intros on themselves. So my name's Shelton Cochran. I'm a manager of business development at R0, which is a biosafety technology company enabling healthier buildings in a sustainable manner. And as I mentioned, we're joined by Jonathan Pierce, Rob Simpson, and Daniel Intalube Camille. Jonathan Pierce, JP, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Yes, hello there. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm JP with Ivanhoé Cambridge. For those of you who don't know Ivanhoé Cambridge, and I guess I'll save Rob saying who we are and what we are, but we are the real estate arm of Canada's second largest pension fund, the Caisse de dépôt à placement du Québec. We, I guess, are a global investor in real estate. We've got about $70 billion in assets under management for our own account. Around the world. We play in four main geographies, Asia Pacific, Europe, US and Latin America, and lastly Canada. And in terms of what I do there, I head up leasing and development and work across transversely with a number of the business teams across multiple asset classes. I'm responsible for the leasing and development functions within the office verticals, the life science groups, retail and logistics. Across the various different geographies. I spend a lot of my time focusing on what tenants want and sort of where the puck might be headed and how those needs and use cases are evolving. So just always making sure that we are really focusing on the end user, recognizing that the end user is the one who ultimately creates the value. So I'm probably the least technical of the three panelists, so please bear with me, and I'll pass it on to my colleague, Rob Simpson.
Thanks, JP. Hi, everybody. Nice to virtually see you and glad to be here with you all today. My name's Rob Simpson, as JP mentioned, with Ivanhoé Cambridge, Senior Director of Sustainable Investment and Head of Climate Change Strategy. I've been with Ivanhoé for just over 8 years. My background in real estate extends back about 20 years. My background's actually in architecture and building science, and my focus has been on, for about 15 years, on sustainable buildings and how we advance that. So there's been significant change over that period of time, and certainly happy to get into some of those details with you all today. Daniel?
Great, thanks. Daniel Intalube Camille from HarborResearch. HarborResearch is a research and consulting firm focused on growth strategy around emerging technologies, informing various ecosystem strategies and business models for technology suppliers and OEMs and manufacturers. We cover virtually every sector of the economy, but I've been particularly focused on emerging networking technologies and have worked with CABA, the Continental Automated Buildings Association, across a number of intelligent building reports, one of which the current research engagement around healthy buildings and indoor environmental quality, R0 is a key sponsor for. So a lot of exposure to intelligent buildings, how they evolved over the last few years, and the applications of emerging technologies. So really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar and looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. So just for a little bit of sort of high-level background on why we're here, why we're doing this webinar today, and why we have these speakers here. So sustainability and ESG targets are at the forefront of most everybody's minds. And what we're doing today is we're covering how to hit those targets and elevate efficiency without disrupting occupant health and comfort. And we know that technology can help reduce costs, improve sustainability, and heighten efficiency. And so, we're going to touch on, where to start when thinking about setting and hitting these goals, how to balance cost, sustainability, and occupant satisfaction. And then we'll go into some specific panelist experiences of past lessons learned and what we need to focus on now and in the future for success. So we'll get right into it with our panelists. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and guys, I'll let you know sort of who should answer these first, and then we can have some discussion around it. So each of you has dedicated a lot of your career to driving positive, healthy buildings change and programs focused on energy efficiency and ESG-related property technology. Can you explain why putting technology at the intersection of sustainability and healthy buildings is key? And JP, why don't we hear from you first on this one?
Sure. I'll give the less technical answer and people can add on. So, you know, the way I look at it really is, I mean, at the end of the day, why do we do a lot of what we do? You know, ultimately it's to remove friction, whether it's, you know, an occupant's use and enjoyment of a space, whether it's facilitating them sort of meeting and exceeding their various sort of different ESG targets. And obviously, you know, technology, I think, has also allowed us to sort of better access the various different sort of data and KPIs to sort of validate the various use cases. But I mean, just looking at it from a very simplistic way, I mean, one of the things I always sort of think about is, you know, the marriage of sort of like sustainability and technology. Well, you know, to me, I mean, let's take an example of sort of far UV disinfection, right? I mean, there's the perfect example, and probably a great segue. But I mean, you know, one of the things that, you know, I think people are sort of concerned about or have been concerned about as they sort of deal with return to office and what that looks like is sort of like the health and safety of building occupants. I mean, according to sort of recent studies, I mean, that sort of health and safety and wellness piece from an employee standpoint, I mean, has gone from sort of one of the lower down reasons, you know, as to why somebody works for a particular employer and works in a particular space to one of the highest. And so, you know, looking at the disinfection model, I mean, that would be a great case in point. I mean, through the sort of, I guess, emergence and duration of the pandemic, I mean, everyone sort of felt like, you know, the way to enhance buildings and enhance safety was, you know, to open it all up, to pump as much fresh air in. I mean, most of us have got our HVAC equipment working on overdrive, which from an air quality and an air change standpoint inside is great, but from a sustainability standpoint, it's an absolute disaster, because really what it's doing is we are, you know, we're basically putting our foot on the gas pedal, with all the consequences that one would expect. So a technology like far UV, for example, I mean, you know, because it's disinfecting through light, you know, you really don't need, you know, the same sort of volume to sort of feel safe and to sort of change the air. It really, I think, can also lead to a reduction in chemical usage for sort of cleaning, maintenance, janitorial and custodial services. And obviously that avoids all the sort of associated, you know, I guess, external factors to the environment, such as VOCs and whatnot, and quite frankly, broader public health impacts, such as, you know, antimicrobial resistance and sort of occupational exposure to these chemicals. And then, so I think you've got the no chemicals piece. You've definitely got the energy efficiency piece. You know, from an energy management standpoint, I mean, it's far less, you know, energy dependent to use light to disinfect than it is to run systems at 130% of capacity to blow the building. And so the consumption and GHG emissions compared to, you know, being entirely reliant on the HVAC system, you know, is really meaningful. So here's a great example. And then I think the other piece too is waste. We're also got a reduction of waste by a result of sort of leveraging a technology such as this. So there's less reliance on sort of containers, on disposable wipes and cleaning products, on, you know, quite frankly, you know, less operation of the HVAC system, fewer filter changes, less materials used, less energy use, and a corresponding reduction in landfill contributions. So from a very simplistic standpoint, that's sort of how I would use it and characterize an example, but maybe Rob, you want to add on and give some additional perspective.
Sure, that was very technical, JP, for somebody not claiming not to be too technical. So that was very good intro. You know, the evolution of this area over the last sort of number of years has been significant. And when we used to consider sustainability in buildings, you know, my role, I used to have a seat kind of occasionally at the end of the table. Now it seems to be more in the middle of the table and far more frequent because there's such an interest in understanding how we make our buildings better from a performance perspective, from an occupant use perspective. And technology has really advanced in the last few years to become sort of core to that. And when we think of a broader lens around, you know, what we're actually trying to do from a sustainability perspective, whether it's the whole issue related to climate change, whether it's, decarbonization of our buildings, the evolution of healthy spaces, health and wellness, health and well-being, all of those things, occupant comfort, amenities, all of that has a sustainability link to it, but it's difficult to treat those in a meaningful way in isolation. And the technology side, in terms of access to data, access to insight, being able to do actionable things as a result of that data that you get. We get piles of data pieces, but if you don't have a method of dealing with those, and technology is helping us understand what is material in that data and what can we actually do with that information to make the building better and align all of those things together, that's really where the technology side has started to bridge the gap between the sort of standalone sustainability approach that maybe historically focused on things like, lighting retrofits and the basic energy efficiency type opportunities. But now it's far more holistic and all encompassing, but without that sort of technology link on being able to action those things, being able to see where the problems are and being able to do something about it. It's been a problem that technology is certainly a big contributor in terms of how it's helping us solve some of those issues.
Definitely, that's very well put. I think you guys hit the nail right on the head in terms of the fundamental tension between green buildings and sort of achieving some of these other aims, and how technology is beginning to enable us to achieve those dual aims. So next question here is, can you simplify the goals towards improving building sustainability? Maybe JP, we'll start with you again on this.
Yeah, I'm going to come at it sort of more from the end user occupant standpoint. And it's funny because I'm actually on location in New York today, and I spent the morning touring one of our partners from Europe around some assets. And we were sort of talking about sort of leasing and how you get the message across. And obviously, I don't think it's really any secret, but I think Europe is definitely, further along the continuum of, having ESG drive real estate decisions. I would say for most corporate users in North America, it's important, but it isn't necessarily driving the bus yet. I see that it will be. In Europe, I think they're definitely sort of a few jumps ahead. And so we were sort of talking a bit about this. But I think ultimately, we're very quick with the certifications that are available that tenants understand, such as LEED and WELL and, Fitwell and, a number of other sort of certifications that people grab onto, and BREEAM in Europe. And obviously the certifications are important because it allows us to sort of sort through the noise and sort of make it sort of simplistic that people can actually understand how one building sort of benchmarks against another and how that sort of fits into their key decision-making strategy. But I think the point that we're missing, and I think we're probably going to touch on this more later, is people have, I think, have probably sort of been largely misinformed because they sort of feel like the only way to execute a robust ESG strategy is to gravitate towards new construction. And, we look at sort of like the top line low-hanging fruits with like, maybe lower energy costs, access to better natural light, enhanced systems with new construction. But what we're missing is the impact of the embedded and the operational carbon as well. And so, the most sustainable building, quite frankly, that you can have from a tenant standpoint is one that already exists. And I think the real estate community as a whole has done a fairly lousy job of, being very much sort of focused on the next thing and the shiny new penny, and really hasn't done perhaps as good enough job, in terms of sort of getting, getting as much as it can out of what's existing and sort of adapting, and reusing what we've got and sort of making it sort of modern and purposeful space. And quite frankly, notwithstanding any physical limitations, that is your most sustainable solution right there, because you're not knocking something down and you're not rebuilding something. So, the impact from a sustainability standpoint, that's the biggest needle mover. The other thing I'll say too is I think tenants are becoming increasingly more focused on this. We're finding, it's funny, one of our tenants in New York, who's a major tenant here, they're a European tenant. So, I mean, they're very, probably, I think, far more sort of in the weeds in terms of all the different sort of data points and KPIs that they use for their ESG reporting internally and their publicly stated goals. But I would say even, the more sort of generic type tenants that we're seeing in most key markets, I mean, it is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. They want to not just know that you're checking the box, they want to know what you're actually doing. And I think from an attraction and retention of talent standpoint, a lot of companies are getting pushed by their employees to be better corporate citizens. There's an expectation, that they do this. And so companies, quite frankly, they want that visibility and they want to be able to cascade that information in terms of whether it's waste diversion or it's bottles saved or whatever it is, or energy consumption. And you're starting to see, as you go through tenant spaces, in many cases, I'm seeing more and more sort of like screen dashboards in spaces, like this is the consumption, this is what's happening, this is how much waste we've saved this month. And so it's definitely, I think, I mean, it's been around a long time. It's been extremely important, but it feels like in North America, at least, we're starting to hit an inflection point where, there's going to be no getting around this. And I think the buildings and landlords that don't either embrace this or reinvent themselves to consider this, are going to be left on the outside looking in. And so, I would say that sort of from an end user standpoint, and if we truly believe that value is created by the end user, we really need to sort of, again, deliver what tenants are wanting and expecting. Otherwise, quite frankly, the building ownership investment group is going to get left behind. So.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe to kind of double click on a piece you said there, JP, around, investing in the existing space and not just sort of looking to the next shiny object.
Yeah.
Rob, do you want to go into a little bit more detail around sort of how you invest, or why you invest in, how you invest in innovative technology, specifically thinking about, existing buildings and, maybe how you create sort of a roadmap for someone who's, not building a new campus, not building a new building, but wants to sort of still kind of upgrade their sustainability profile of their space?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So Ivanhoé has about 800 plus or minus assets globally in all different asset classes. And when we created, maybe just to set a little context, we've set a net zero emissions target for 2040 on the operational side of our performance, meaning, the energy that we consume is largely responsible for most of our emissions on our operational assets. That excludes embodied carbon in the sort of new construction that JP was referring to. But when we started to dig into that data as we built out that strategy a couple of years ago, we realized that, we have about maybe 30 assets that are responsible for about 50% of our overall emissions. So quickly by doing that, well, that process wasn't quick, but once you have that insight, all of a sudden you're not trying to solve 800 problems, you're trying to solve 30 problems. And it breaks it down into a much more sort of manageable number. And while there's certainly still a lot of work to do, that helps provide some focus. You can focus on key markets. We found that certain markets had a greater number of assets just given, their carbon intensity of their electricity grid, for example. And by starting to do that, you can bucket things together. You can look for opportunities in markets for, incentives through utilities or government rebates, tax credit opportunities. Where have you got legislative requirements like in New York's LL 97 that's actually driving owners like us to do things around decarbonization, and how do we then prioritize what needs to be done there? So it is possible to break this down into smaller, manageable pieces, and you can then build out sort of concrete plans from that. And that then you get into the details of things like, deeper energy audits than we have probably done in the past. I think everyone, as best practices probably does like a level 1 kind of ASHRAE audit every few years. Our findings are that we need to go much deeper than that. We need to understand beyond the sort of cursory look, what's driving emissions in these particular assets, what are the actual fuel sources, what is the equipment that is there, how is it performing, what vintage is it, when is it up for renewal, and start piecing again all of those things together. So by doing all of that, you start to build a roadmap per asset, of what needs to be done. And then you can tie in the sort of the finance, how does this get capitalized, if at all? Are there other financial models that we can follow to execute on some of these things? And we can get into a few more of those details after. But the whole point of this is it's an innovative way compared to how we used to do things in how we maximize what we're trying to do with the sort of best effort outcome return. It's silly to spend time evaluating 800 assets when the bang for the buck is really spent on a much smaller number than that to get quicker wins and faster returns. So that's essentially how we've approached it over the last couple of years.
That makes sense. So it's identifying, the problems as they are, getting better data and more granular data and dynamic data, and then executing based on that sort of, vision
Absolutely.
you can have over the assets. That makes sense.
And maybe just to touch on one quick thing that JP mentioned around, tenants, we are seeing more now in the North American context, tenants reaching out to us, wanting to understand their energy performance, different waste strategies that are available through the building, a number of things that 2-3 years ago, we weren't getting those questions. So more and more there is becoming that sort of symbiotic relationship between tenant and landlord that historically hasn't always been there with the ESG things. So that's certainly encouraging, especially in the North American context.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's change gears here a little bit. And this next question is, what technology trends have you been seeing in the market, and how has that changed over the past 5 to 10 years? Daniel, let's start with you on this one.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I'll start from kind of painting a picture of how Harbor kind of perceives and understands the intelligent building space. So, largely I think to date, and Jonathan kind of touched on this, a lot of the energy management applications technologies that we've seen are simple applications. They have relatively, or they're part of relatively standalone strategies. But we are, obviously seeing the integration of sustainable power and sort of movement from sort of reactive analytics towards more prescriptive, predictive analytics. And that all is centered around a handful of key technologies and approaches to data management and analytics that are pretty critical for the advancement of the industry. So we really see movement towards the sort of intersection of modern grid infrastructure, BMS, BAS systems, and advanced analytics and data management as kind of the combination of technologies, strategies, and approaches that will really kind of push sustainability forward in the building space. And so when we think about modern grid infrastructure, everything from advanced metering infrastructure to distributed energy resources, but almost more importantly, grid interactive, efficient buildings. And so that concept really takes this sort of fluid approach and data exchange between smart grid applications and building automation and management applications all around energy usage and energy consumption, optimizing that balance. But really, in order to do that, there needs to be, sort of new defined approaches, leveraging AI, advanced analytics, and more open exchange of data across various grid and building systems. And so we see things like BACnet as, a protocol where, we're starting to see some consolidation around data communication. But things like Brick or Project Haystack are really focused on sort of standardizing the sort of semantics and data labeling across different building systems and allowing for that interactivity with the grid. And so that data story, I think, is a critical component for success in the sustainability and energy management story. But also as we move towards a more holistic approach to sustainability and healthy buildings, where you're not just taking or you're not just integrating technology as part of isolated strategies, but you're really building a profile of sustainability and health for a given building. But all of that really should, focus in on, as Jonathan has mentioned as well, the occupant, really positioning the occupant at the center of that. And so things like occupancy sensing and the diversity of sensing technologies around, air quality, water quality, lighting and visualization and thermal comfort. All of these technologies need to combine to really provide that platform from which you can optimize and orchestrate building automation systems in both a sustainable manner and while promoting occupant health. And some of our research in the current, CABA report we're developing, there have been some interesting, highlights around technologies that really need to position the occupant physiology at the center of the design. And that is definitely one of the big challenges with really advancing the sort of healthy building side of things, is really how to measure occupant health, wellness, so you can start to tie that to productivity improvements and actually see the value from these types of technologies. But ultimately, when that grid interactive strategy, BMS, BAS strategy, and advanced analytics and data management, when all of those come together, you can really start to leverage the value around things like digital twins, DER, AMI, and sensor fusion to create more of a holistic integrated strategy across both sustainability systems and occupant health and wellness systems.
Yeah, that's great. And Rob, maybe could you provide, whether it's an example on one of your buildings or just perspective from, where you sit, in your position in Ivanhoé, some examples of, what Daniel was saying around integrating building management system into this sort of broader plan and balancing, a sustainable building goal with other objectives where you're trying to sort of, keep the tenant happy, keep the tenant productive.
Yeah, I mean, the points made, I think, were all really, really relevant. It's, again, historically, we've sometimes treated many of these problems in isolation and have tried to deal with them in isolation. And I think one thing we're very mindful of now is, in terms of planning, is that these are big problems that all, or big challenges that all tie together. So when you're considering replacements of equipment, don't replace that equipment with the mindset of what's that going to do for you now. Think about it. How is that going to help evolve your sort of smart building strategy down the road? What are you putting in now that is allowing that building to evolve over time, that you're not going to have to replace what you just put in 5 years from now because it wasn't the right solution, or it wasn't the right, you hadn't thought through it in terms of the evolution of what that building needed to do. And that, that ties with the whole tenant piece, the energy sourcing, all of that. And really, it means taking a longer view. And, the big question always is, well, the cost of doing this upfront is significant, and we need to really fundamentally sort of change that approach. We can't continue to rely on everything having a less than 5-year payback to justify this type of innovative initiative. And we're really focused on trying to understand that and how it has a sort of value proposition down the line, whether it's through building valuation at exit, whether it's through improved operating costs, whether it's through something that the tenant will benefit from in terms of their own ESG objectives and target setting. Does it help with retaining tenants? Does it help with lease structures? There's a whole host of things we're trying to integrate into the discussion, and think in that sort of longer term framework.
Totally. And that's a perfect segue actually to this next topic. Thinking about time horizons and how we evaluate these things. Obviously the world it's very different today than it was, 18 months ago, 24 months ago. And so what I want to talk about next is, how's the recent climate around inflation and rising costs of construction and maintenance affected prioritizing sustainable solutions? And what impact is that having on goals and outcomes? Daniel, let's start with you on this one.
Sure, great. So I would say, historically, and especially pre-pandemic, sustainability and energy management were key priorities for operators. And then obviously, pandemic introduced this, I would say, wave of interest and prioritization around investments in technologies that promote occupant health and wellness. The value around those types of solutions is a little trickier than your traditional energy management and sustainability. Obviously, with a lot of integration of sustainable building operations, you have a clear line of sight to energy savings, reducing your carbon footprint, et cetera. But when we think about building health and wellness, and there definitely has been a continued interest from operators, you start to deal with sort of a balance of intangible and tangible value creation from these types of practices and technologies. And so, there's still a lot of ongoing research around, what are those quantifiable variables for healthy buildings and indoor environmental quality. But in some of the early research that has really looked at those types of technologies over the last couple of years, productivity has been a key focus where, improving or optimizing that occupant comfort, ensuring, a healthy level of air quality, healthy level of lighting, et cetera, it, absolutely improves the productivity of, office workers, of people working in these different indoor environments, to the tune of, increasing that productivity by, 4 to 6%. On average, which translates into dollars for these businesses. But also with regard to some of the certifications, Fitwel and Well, also have observed an increase in rent premiums, sort of analogous to that of LEEDs and how we saw LEEDs develop over the last handful of years here. And so when we really dive into some of the key areas that we're looking at for healthy buildings, indoor air quality, thermal comfort, acoustic, visual, environmental factors. We can also start to tie that to things like the long-term health of occupants. We spend 90% of our times indoors, and especially in office and working environments. If that time is spent in areas with poor air quality, poor lighting, that does contribute to illness and long-term chronic diseases. And so, when businesses are spending between $14,000 and $20,000 a year per employee on insurance, those medical expenses definitely add up in the P&L of a given operation. And so, promoting the environment where it can ensure healthy occupants, productive occupants, starts to really translate into some tangible value. And I think that it's a big challenge for a lot of the technology suppliers, operators, and even public sector entities to really establish these standards around indoor health and integrate that into building design, and then actually track the data collection and understand the true value over time. But across some early indicators, productivity and the economic value through rent premiums have been two of the key areas, particularly for healthy buildings, where they've definitely seen very tangible returns and tangible value around these types of technologies.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. So I'm gonna move to the next section here and take a deeper dive into some actionable and cost-effective strategies that organizations can take. And Rob, maybe we can start with you, and if you could give us some examples of how to strategize for a particular space, anything in your portfolio, or as JP was mentioning early on, challenges around using the HVAC system to achieve healthier buildings. Any sort of specific examples you can give.
Sure. I mentioned it earlier, but really fundamental to this is audits and good data and understanding the performance of your asset or space and what's driving that. That's the place to start. There are quick wins. Not everything needs to have a long engineering plan behind it. We've implemented some things that I can touch on momentarily over the last year or two, just on HVAC in terms of motor replacements from traditional induction motors to a far more efficient motor that we've seen energy savings upwards of 40-ish% on the overall unit. So there are things that can be done, and that was a relatively straightforward, plug and play type exercise. We need to think a little differently. We need to really be mindful of the old sort of standard way of doing things, particularly mechanically. We've often or historically have designed buildings to certain thresholds in terms of occupancy, in terms of the amount of fresh air, and understanding there are code requirements to all of this, but there's a smarter way to do it. When we've looked at some of the data on some of our retail assets, for example, we're over ventilating some of those spaces by 2 or 3 times. And every time you're bringing in unnecessary ventilation, you need to heat it or you need to cool it. That's additional energy consumption. It's just waste. The building industry globally is responsible for approximately 40% of global emissions. There's a huge amount of opportunity in there for us to improve that, because so much of the energy that we consume is actually wasted through, heat loss or whatever. And again, a number of things we can chat about there, but we've looked at heat recovery opportunities. We're in certain markets where we're actually evaluating full electrification, so moving away from natural gas and steam completely. Certain markets are more amenable to that based on a number of factors than others, but those are things that we're looking at very closely and expect to be able to implement some of that. And then, again, back on the HVAC side specifically, you have to heat, you have to cool, and you have to ventilate. So how do you do that in a smart, intelligent way? And it's having automation systems that are advanced enough and intelligent enough to tune those things, tied with occupancy, tied with, what other metrics you can bring in to the controls and operations of that. That's really important, so that we're not unnecessarily treating spaces that don't need it. The filtration, obviously, certainly the discussion around UV and how we clean that air so you can recycle it versus bringing in new air that needs to be treated. All of these things there's a bunch of different stuff. It's complicated, yet it's relatively straightforward if you approach it in the right manner, and that's what we're trying to be mindful of in how we're doing this.
Yeah, totally. And on that topic, can you give any examples of other innovations or technologies other than any we've discussed that have been accelerated in their adoption by the COVID pandemic, and sort of where we find ourselves now in thinking about trying to hit these various building goals?
Well, I mean, one of the things out of the pandemic, it kind of proved to the world that we can, at least for a period of time, collectively work towards solving a big challenge. And I think that's maybe translated a little bit down to buildings and our role within decarbonization and climate change. There's a sense that it seems to me that the last couple of years has been more impactful in terms of getting commitments out of large real estate players and small than all of the years combined up until that point. So I think we've seen it expedited in terms of what needs to be done. There's certainly a bigger push on smart buildings, as we've touched on briefly, aligning all of these things, making sure that we're considering longer term goals versus just immediate needs. When we're replacing systems, or when we're replacing a rooftop unit, are you just going in and replacing it with an updated version of the same rooftop unit? No, we should really consider, is that actually the best technology to be using? Can we look at something different? Do we in fact even need it? Are we over-ventilating, overheating, overcooling a particular space based on a design standard from 15 or 20 years ago that's no longer valid? So those conversations are now sort of front and center, whereas pre-pandemic, it was more sort of business as usual in how we thought about some of these things. If we could demonstrate an energy savings out of it, then it was worth the discussion. If we couldn't in the short term, probably something that we weren't going to pursue. So, generally I would say there's more of an appetite to consider alternative, innovative solutions that we probably didn't have in the past. But JP, maybe you can add anything else on that side.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. I think coming at it again fairly simplistically from the end user standpoint, I think if we simplify this to sort of its most simple thing, right? I mean, I think the wellness and the sustainability, and if we can sort of improve, the healthiness and the sustainability of the workplace, whether it's, corporate, whether it's public sector, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, it doesn't really matter. But I think when you can start sort of looking at things that are, the future of healthy buildings, I mean, what does that really look like? Well, I mean, I think it's going to be like achieving some real tangibles. Like, can we reduce the number of sick days and improve productivity, right? How do we measure that? Like, as some of the things that we're sort of doing very intentionally, we talked a little bit about, different disinfection tools and what that means in terms of like lower energy and less waste. But I mean, why are we doing that? Well, why are we doing that? We're trying to reduce sick days. We're trying to improve productivity. I mean, we can, mitigate, I think, some of the safety concerns that are definitely an impediment in the return to office narrative that's sort of playing in real time right in front of us. I mean, obviously we've talked about, running HVAC at much higher levels. I mean, we're creating additional waste, we're spending more energy. And I think the model that we can sort of show that there's another way to go around it to sort of deliver that sort of safety and wellness piece without cranking the systems, theoretically should resonate, well with occupants. So, I mean, I go back to a quote that a guy called Anthony Slumbers shared with me, and it always stuck with me. And he said, he said, the office is basically like a hammer. He said, people basically, that they don't necessarily want an office. Like, you don't necessarily want a hammer, you want a hole in the wall. And the hammer gets you the hole in the wall. And, I think people don't necessarily want an office, they want a productive and engaged workforce, right? And so, it's a very similar analogy. And so, if you make people feel safe, if you feel that, because there's a lot of focus right now, I think, in terms of the sustainability piece of the commute and the traveling to the office as well. And that isn't something that we've sort of touched on yet to date. And so people are sort of starting to feel like, hey, there's a sustainability narrative, that if I stay remote or if I stay working from home, then maybe that's a good thing from a sustainability standpoint. But I think sort of showing that the workplace can in many ways sort of do that, and then you can sort of layer on many of those sort of non-tangible benefits that I think a lot of companies are struggling with right now, which is mentorship and transfer of knowledge and productivity and having those sort of casual collisions where people are sort of bumping into each other and learning, and rather than everything sort of very transactional based when you're scheduling sort of Teams calls or Zoom calls on half-hour or 45-minute increments. It's very transactional, it's very intentional, but some of those best conversations and some of those best collaborations and innovation, whether it's on new technologies or on operating of a business, it happens in a very casual setting. I mean, every time I go into the office, and whenever I'm in my hometown, I try to go into the office. I always come away thinking I would never have had that conversation if I'd have stayed home today, right? And so, not to say that there's not a lot of things that you can do effectively remotely. The last 2.5 years has definitely taught us that we can do that, and sort of like the quiet heads down work is there. But I mean, at the end of the day, we want to be around people, and I think the technology enables us to do that safely. And we don't necessarily need to feel bad that we're I guess doing something that's sort of unsustainable as part of that. So I think it all sort of ultimately sort of feeds into one another. Is that there's the corporate level sustainability piece, there's the people wanting to have more of an intentional sort of feeling like they're good corporate citizens, feeling like they belong and work for a company that actually cares and that's doing its part and that is walking the walk, so to speak, rather than just sort of greenwashing its statistics. There's a lot of discussion on that right now. And so I think it's, I think from what the healthy buildings look like, I mean, I don't honestly think it's sort of one size fits all. I think a healthy building can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think, quite frankly, it's making people feel safe in the workforce. It's removing the barriers and making it more inclusive to be together and to be able to sort of collaborate together. And I think if we can along the way sort of reduce our energy consumption, better measure our KPIs, use occupancy sensors, for example, to determine which are high use areas of the building, which could then in turn lead us to sort of moderate or refine our cleaning protocols, right? So if we've got higher traffic areas, are there areas then that we need to spend more time and being, a bit more deliberate on making sure we're properly sanitized? But, right now, when not everyone's coming into an office 5 days a week, maybe there's parts from a sustainability standpoint that we don't necessarily need to, get out the the spray bottles and sanitize every night. There has to be a better way. And I think the technology can sort of help us, guide us in that part and eliminate the waste, not just the physical waste, but also the operational waste of cleaning and disinfecting, areas that don't necessarily need to be done. So, I mean, it's probably a bit of an all over the place answer, but I mean, I think it's not a simple question. It's sort of like, it's a confluence of all those factors together. I think that really, this is what tenants are thinking about. They're thinking about the absenteeism, the productivity, and the safety, and above all, I think the ESG standpoint.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think you touched on a bunch of different points there, but really, that was a perfect description of what Ivanhoé tenants are looking for, right now and for the future. I think it's the balance between all those things. Well, that's the end of our sort of structured section, and we have a little under 15 minutes left now, and we'll go into sort of a little bit more of a rapid fire Q&A on questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, and then there's some live questions as well. And just as a reminder, any questions that are asked that we don't get to now will be consolidated and addressed in an FAQ that gets sent out with the recording of this webinar. So I'll start with a question for Daniel here, which is, can you give an example of indoor air quality, or maybe sort of a definition of it and how it's measured, and maybe if you can touch on how it's sort of been considered historically, and if and how that's changed in the recent past.
Sure. Yeah, great. So one of the things that I mentioned during one of my responses was the sort of evolution of a lot of sensing technologies that really center the human physiology, occupant physiology, and the inherent design of the solution itself. And so I would say that the understanding of indoor air quality has advanced pretty significantly in recent years, where it's not just looking at particulate matter or carbon dioxide, but covers everything from nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxides, ozone, et cetera. So there are a diversity of different air sensing technologies that specifically cater to the different impacts on a given occupant's health or wellness. So it's really around creating packaged solutions with that might bring things like occupancy sensing with a whole suite of certain chemical compounds, particulate matter sensing technologies to really create that full view and profile of what indoor air quality and environmental quality looks like. And so in that, by measuring different types of particulates, chemicals, et cetera, in the air, that's where you really get into the value of feeding that into a building management system, or informing some sort of sanitation system to say that there are a number of in a conference center there are over 100 occupants in this particular space, but we are seeing a higher level of CO2 in that space. Let's either adjust ventilation or deploy UV sanitation to really establish an equilibrium in the air quality. So it's a combination of really packaging a diverse sensor suite, and then being able to really interface that with some sort of automated response within the building.
Yeah, that's great. All right, next question here. Rob, it would be great if you could answer this one. Is it technically and economically useful to invest in a building older than 20 years to refurbish it to make it fit for decarbonization by 2050? Are there hard and fast rules you use about thinking about when is a building not worth investing in?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we sort of grapple with. There's no, like most things we do, there's no single answer. Really, you need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And one of the things to consider on the sort of taking an older asset and bringing it up to a certain standard is, there's embodied carbon inherent in that asset that was built a number of years ago. And you sort of have to weigh what's the math if you were to knock it down and build new versus if you were to redevelop it, take advantage of the embodied carbon that's already in there that you're technically not going to duplicate, but can you bring it up to a standard where it performs going forward operationally to a standard that can sort of meet a net zero requirement? And sometimes you can. Sometimes the reality is it's difficult because you know, floor to floor heights, materials, systems and equipment, if you have to, you know, take apart half the building to run new mechanical equipment, maybe the economics don't work out alongside the analysis of the carbon impact. So you really need to look at it from sort of the full equation. Fundamentally, we would like to think that adaptive reuse of existing assets is a better alternative environmentally, and I think in most cases it probably is, but we would need to look at those cases in isolation.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'll stick on you with this question. How much or little do carbon offsets feature in Ivanhoé Cambridge's net zero strategy, and what's the bar for legitimacy of those offsets?
It's a very timely question. There's a lot of stuff in the market right now on offsets. Our strategic plan related to offsets is that we do everything we possibly can and finish with offsets. So if we get 95% of the way to net zero and have exercised sort of all opportunities related to renewable energy procurement, energy efficiency, energy management, regional grid decarbonization, buying and selling of assets, whatever it happens to be that helps along on the trajectory, at the end of the day, there will be some residual emissions undoubtedly, and those will likely need to be solved with offsets. But we certainly don't start with them. We tend to hope to finish with them. And the other thing to that is as technology continues to evolve and companies continue to innovate and drive the cost down of technologies that are not quite ready for market yet, you know, perhaps by 2040, there's solutions to those remaining emissions that offsets are not required. So it's not part of our sort of fundamental plan. Not to say in certain cases that it doesn't make sense. There's certainly different structures of offsets, different qualities of offsets. We would always want to ensure that we were procuring the highest quality offsets that we could. For our corporate travel, for example, we do offset, but we treat that differently from an accounting perspective and don't, you know, that's a small percentage relative to our building performance and building emissions. So it was a fairly wordy answer, but there's a role for them to a certain degree, but not prioritizing that at all.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like the way you put it. You know, you do everything you possibly can, and then that's just the additional kind of last yard line or whatever it may be.
Exactly.
JP, let's go to you for this question. This is broad, so I'll let you answer however you want. But what's the most challenging sustainability issue? And I guess let's think about it from sort of, you know, from the built environment, you know, Ivanhoé's portfolio broadly.
Yeah, that is a broad question. Not even sure where to begin with that one, but I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think it really depends the most challenging for whom. Do you mean for our occupants? Do you mean for Ivanhoé Cambridge? You know, what is it? I mean, I think one of the things that we really struggle with is, you know, at a corporate level, is, you know, obviously sort of really sort of focusing on, you know, the operational, you know, how can we improve? How can we transition? You know, as Rob talked about, I mean, we've obviously stated our objective of sort of net zero by 2040. We've got certain jurisdictions in which we operate in where, you know, governmental authorities are sort of forcing our hand in a good way. And I would say New York is one such jurisdiction with local law 97. And so there's a lot of compliance there. And so, you know, I mean, I think, you know, there's a number of different things, but I think ultimately it kind of goes back to what we talked about is we've got a variety of different holdings around the world, some old and some new. You know, I think operationally, the new construction buildings, you know, probably, you know, have a lower operational footprint than the older buildings. However, I think they have a far more invasive, I guess, footprint if you sort of layer into the whole, construction and recycling, side of things. So, the impact to build new versus to adaptive reuse, I think, is massive. And so, to give you an example of this, I mean, we just recently moved on a deal in Australia. I think it's in Melbourne. It's a former woolen mill. It's called Young Husband, which is an interesting name, but that's the Young Husband Woolen Company, not any other connotations. And they basically, I mean, we're pretty excited about it because, I mean, it's an unbelievable sort of low-rise building that is going to be sort of transformed into, pretty inspiring creative space. It has many of the ingredients that end users are looking for, outdoor space, operable windows, high ceilings. And, I think the issue that we've sort of seen in some of these earlier adaptive reuse things is many of the sort of the physical constraints of sort of functionally obsolete real estate, has limited the efficiency and impact and quite frankly, the desirability of some of these sort of adaptive reuse projects. And I think, as we sort of moved forward and sort of figured out a better way to, operate these with different technologies and more advanced systems, delivering a more authentic experience, being able to sort of reuse more elements of it, and being able to sort of leverage, the site conditions that you find in any given instance, it allows us, I think, a more versatile playbook. So, I mean, I think it's, again, all over the place on that answer, but I think it's one of these things that, there's lots of challenges that we have. Those are probably some of the key ones. And I think our tenants, probably the biggest challenge that they have, and we're trying to do a really good job to support them, is making sure that, they get all the necessary data and KPIs that they're looking for. How do we sort of solve them? So, how do they better understand what's happening at the asset level and what we're doing at the corporate level, so that in turn can sort of flow up to their, ESG reporting and requirements and their own stated objectives. And so right now, I sort of feel like, landlords, the building industry, tenants, I mean, everyone has got these siloed objectives. And I think one of the biggest challenges, quite frankly, is going to be trying to put some of this stuff together and unpack it so that we're all really pulling in the same direction. I mean, we all want the same thing, which is to minimize our impact on, on the earth, and to hopefully leave things in a better place than how we found them, right? And so, I tend to find like a siloed approach will get us there, but it will maybe not get us there in the most efficient way. And I think if the different sort of stakeholder groups spent more time better understanding each other's needs and wants, we might be able to accelerate the change of pace, or the pace of change. That's it.
Perfect. That is a perfect place to end it. Perfect closing remarks there, JP. So I want to just pause here and thank everybody. Thank all the attendees for listening and for joining. Thank you guys. Thank the panelists for participating. Really great conversation today. And then I want to let everybody know that R0 will be hosting a follow-up webinar next Tuesday, the 20th, focused on the challenges specifically with HVAC from a sustainability perspective and how UVC can help address those. So really kind of drilling deep on that topic. After you close out of this webinar, there will be a little pop-up that invites you to sign up for that webinar. All right, thank you everybody, and have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.